Welcome to Every Church a Peace Church. This is a program that promotes the belief that the church could turn the world towards peace if the church lived and taught as Jesus lived and taught. My name is Don Edwards. I'm the host and producer of this program, and we have a very, very interesting program with a very interesting guest. Every morning, it's my and my family's practice to get our children ready for school. My 12-year-old, my 7-year-old, they pack their backpacks with books, their homework that they did the night before, or at least supposed to have done the night before. Put it by the door and get ready to go to school in the morning. My wife takes my 12-year-old to school, and I take my 7-year-old to a different school. But for about 300,000 children in various parts of this planet, the morning means that they don't pick up their backpack to go to school, but pick up an AK-47 or a rocket-propelled launcher and go off to battle. This is a program where we're going to discuss the phenomenon of using children as soldiers. And my guest today is Jimmie Briggs.
Thank you.
Jimmie, welcome to Every Church a Peace Church. Let me give you a little introduction about Jimmie. Jimmie is a Morehouse graduate. We share that.
Yes.
He's also a journalist, an author with Life magazine. It was his previous assignment. He's now a freelance author and author of a book that has just recently came out in August.
Yes, it did.
Called Innocence Lost: When Child Soldiers Go to War. It's a first-person account of Jimmie's interviews and experiences as he traveled to very dangerous places, Sri Lanka, and talked with the Tamil Tigers, and Rwanda, Afghanistan, Uganda. With that backdrop, he's interviewed people who were children soldiers. He's talked to the victims. He's talked to the soldiers. He's talked to the family of the victims. And he's going to recount that story to us in this program. Jimmie, tell me, what led you to go in this direction about exploring the phenomenon of using children as combatants?
Prior to starting this project, I had been working on staff at Life magazine for a number of years, primarily focusing on stories dealing with children's rights, juvenile violence, gang culture, primarily here in the United States. In the spring of 1997, Life magazine sent myself and a photographer to Zaire, now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC. And it was there that I first encountered, child soldiers firsthand. Young kids, boys and girls in uniform, carrying rifles, carrying rockets, carrying grenades, fighting the front lines of a war between a guerrilla movement led by Laurent Kabila against the government of the then dictator Mobutu Sese Seko. And after experiencing and hearing the stories of child soldiers in that country, I felt compelled to explore the issue further, not only in Africa, but other parts of the world as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've been to several places in this adventure of yours, and it's taken how long to get the information to put together in Innocence Lost?
When I first conceived of the idea of doing this book, I saw it as a relatively short journey. I figured maybe 1-2 years at the most. At the end of the day, it took 6.5, almost 7 years to complete, and that's focusing on 5 different countries and going back and forth to those countries over time, developing relationships with young people affected by war, with child soldiers, and with their families as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, the experiences that you had, you put in your book, and you're an excellent writer.
Thank you.
It's the prose is very very colorful, and your descriptions of the horrors of those children who are induced into war, and the aftermath is something that's very, very remarkable and very, very hard to read sometimes. The idea of 13 and 12-year-olds and 8-year-olds killing
Yes.
and being killed and being used in these types of conflicts all over the world. Estimated to be at any given point in time, 300,000
Yes.
children under the age of 18 being used by adults in their battles. What countries did you go to?
I focused on 5 countries, Don. Uganda and Rwanda in Africa, Sri Lanka, Columbia, and Afghanistan. And in each country, I approached each situation differently because I wanted to focus on particular facets of this phenomena of child soldiers or war-affected kids in each place.
Mm-hmm. In Uganda, you had some very difficult. I guess they all were difficult,
Yes.
but you were actually fired upon in Uganda.
Yes.
Is that right? You want to tell us about
Sure.
that particular experience?
I mean, going into this project, just by the nature of it, war and young people, I expected there to be risk, and there were definitely physical risk, of course, but I think more surprising for me were the emotional risk, the emotional drain. Uganda really, I first started going there at the beginning of the trip, beginning of this journey, and doing the book, and really, Uganda was my baptism under fire, literally, because it was there that I first encountered, war dead firsthand, saw that happen. And in one case, I was a part of a convoy which was attacked by the guerrilla group in northern Uganda, the LRA, the Lord's Resistance Army. And on this particular day that our convoy was attacked, 2 people were killed in the vehicle in front of me, which was obviously a very heavy experience. Subsequent to that attack, I ended up being sort of caught, or more specifically lost, in a firefight between government soldiers and guerrillas from the LRA. And thankfully, I was able to stumble my way out of it, stumble out of it unharmed, safely.
Yeah, well, that was quite interesting reading about that particular experience. Tell us, what is the phenomenon of child soldiering? It's not a new phenomenon, but tell our audience just
Sure.
about that concept.
Sure. I mean, as you say, the use of children in war, it's not a new phenomenon. I mean, you can go back to the Roman Empire, you can go back to the Civil War in our own country, World War II, and children were always used, underage children under the age of 18 were always found. They were always used in combat. I think in the past 20, 30 years, though, there's been sort of a mushrooming, this tremendous growth of using kids in war. Primarily, I think because, one, the weapons that are available now in conflict, particularly guerrilla warfare, are such that they can be used by young people. We're talking about AK-47s, automatic rifles, automatic handguns, pistols, grenades, and so forth. And these are all weapons that they're very available because of the illegal trade going to Africa, going to Latin America, going to Asia. But they're also weapons that can be maintained and used by young people and transported, which makes the use of kids more attractive for the adults that exploit them in this way. Also, I think that the nature of warfare itself has changed, where those segments of the population which previously weren't targeted in war are now being targeted. You're seeing more attacks on women. Rape as a weapon of war is becoming much more common. You're seeing more direct assaults on civilian populations, and in most situations, it's the adult men who go off to fight war. But when those adult men are captured, are wounded, are killed, or disappear, who's left behind? It's women, it's elderly, and it's children. And children in most communities are the largest pool of people in a community. Kids comprise the greatest segment of that community. And so now kids, they're the most attractive pool of recruits. I mean, if there are no adult men to recruit, you go to the kids, because now they can carry these weapons and they can use them just as effectively as an adult would, probably more effectively, because kids, as we know here, those of us who are parents, or we all were kids once, but we know that kids have less inhibitions in terms of committing these atrocities, these brutal acts, they're much less inhibited to commit them than an adult would be.
So it's a matter of, well, what's available to help me fight this battle. Are children used because of their susceptibility, in addition to the fact that the numbers are available, but because they are impressionable, that they can be used to recruit in these battles worldwide?
That's exactly the case. I mean, kids, they can be very effectively, very quickly molded into the type of soldier that you want them to become. I think, their innocence, their naivete.
We're talking about like 9-year-old, 10-year-olds.
Exactly. I mean, 8, 9, 10 years old. I mean, that's definitely towards the younger end of the spectrum. I mean, most of the kids I encountered in my book were in their early teens, mid-teens. But I do have to say I did encounter kids in Colombia and Uganda and Sri Lanka who were preteen, 9, 10, 11 years old, and also in the Congo as well. If these kids are able to carry the equipment, or if they're able to serve in some capacity as a scout, as a cook, and if you're a girl, you're probably going to be a sexual servant to an adult commander. They're very attractive, to be pulled in.
That's something. Now, how do now the children, once the battle is over or the conflict is over, what happens to these children if they survive?
If they survive, the experience is physically done. I mean, there's always the issue of the mental landscape. What's the psychological legacy of conflict? Physically, maybe you weren't wounded, but maybe you survived. But what's the consequence mentally? And many kids, there's a need for these kids to be counseled, to be rehabilitated. By that I mean, most child soldiers who survive their experiences in combat, they are assisted through non-governmental organizations such as World Vision, Save the Children, the International Rescue Committee, or they may be assisted by the national government itself to sort of help them readjust to being back into society as civilians, as disarmed, demobilized children, and just dealing with that whole process of having killed people, seeing people killed around you, or being threatened with death yourself. I mean, these things leave, obviously, a strong impression on anyone, but particularly young people. And I think most child soldiers who become adults will say that there was always a need for them to receive some sort of counseling, some sort of psychosocial help to process their experiences and to process the guilt or anger they may feel over having been in conflict as a youth.
What does how is this use of children in war, how is it being addressed by the international community and by the United States as part of that community?
I think, to be very honest with you, Don, again, from my experience, from my personal perspective, so much more could be done. There exists something called the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the CRC. And this is an international treaty, it's law, that outlines and recognizes the universal rights of children throughout the world: education, housing, nourishment, reproductive health rights. And the United States and Somalia are the only two countries in the world that have not ratified and signed this document, which I think is a very telling symbol of our meaning American, our own lack of priority when it comes to children's rights. The Convention on the Rights of the Child has...
Why is that? Why is the United States and Somalia bedfellows in the only two countries in the world that have not adopted this particular convention about children's rights?
Somalia, because Somalia is seen, for all practical purposes, a failed state. I mean, there's no central government to speak of which could authorize a ratification and signing of this document. In the case of the United States, I think it's a culmination of factors, one of which is the fact that, this country notoriously is loath to endorse or sign documents, international documents, law, treaties, which will bind us, as we see binding us to something we're not willing to commit to. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, it recognizes reproductive health rights, which that's where you're getting into, the whole abortion rights territory of young people. The Convention on the Rights of the Child also says it's illegal to execute a juvenile. There's no death penalty for juveniles, and of course, we in the United States, we do sentence juveniles to death.
Yeah.
I think there's this comfort over elevating the status of children to the level where it should be, to the level where all young people, it's their inherent rights. And I think there's a fear that if we formally recognize it, then many of the laws that we are enacting federally and statewide, state by state, would be usurped by this international document. There's, just to add on, there's an optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, sort of an amendment, if you will, which sets the minimum age for recruitment at 18 years old internationally. What that means is that the age of 18 is the youngest age at which young people can be recruited into the military to fight. But there's a caveat to that. The United States, Great Britain, and a few other countries in Western Europe primarily wanted sort of a loophole for them. And that loophole allows national governments to recruit young people at 17 years old. So already there's a double standard. And we're telling the world that 18, that's when one enters into adulthood. That's the minimum age. But, we're going to have this exception for 17-year-olds so that we can make our national recruitment quotas, which is really why it exists.
Interesting. The weapons that are being used in these conflicts are made all over the world, but they're also made in the United States and sold by the United States. Did you see American-made weapons in your travels?
The most common weapon I saw, at least in terms of automatic rifles, was the AK-47. I think more so than its American counterpart, the M16, the AK-47 is much more prevalent. It's much more available, in part because it has fewer problems than the M16. It doesn't jam as much. It's very easy to load, very easy to maintain. I did see some M16s. I did see, American-made
mines.
Not mines, but grenades, shoulder-held rocket launchers, things of that nature. In some cases, automatic handguns. That was much more common to see than the automatic rifles, in fact.
Is there any prohibition that would prevent our government from selling those types of weapons to these various militias?
Right. Well, for the most part, on the face of it, Don, these weapons are being sold legally. American companies, of course, have the right to sell weapons, to whoever they want, for the most part, with some degree of regulation. But what happens is that there aren't enough safety catches to prevent these weapons once they end up with this government, or once they end up with this security company, or whoever, this army with whom we're providing military aid. There's no guarantee that the weapons won't end up in the hands of non-governmental groups or guerrilla groups that use kids. And I think that's where the area we have to focus on is the illegal trafficking. But there's this tendency to resist any effort to curtail the weapons ending up in the hands of people who we'd rather not have.
Now, in your book, Innocence Lost, you've talk about, you interview many of the children who were used in Rwanda, for example, in that situation, that horrific situation, and in other places. How did this affect you, being so close to such horror, both being perpetrated by the children and having it perpetrated on the children?
I think, Don, like most most American boys specifically, I grew up in Missouri. In fact, sort of buying this historical myth about warfare, about being a soldier. I saw the old war films. I saw the movies in the 70s and 80s and 90s.
We played soldier in our backyards.
Exactly. And it's ingrained in us, this idea of this admiration, this mythologizing of what it means to be in a war, to be a soldier. And probably until I began this book, I felt the same way. Once I started going to these countries and meeting, families that were living the day-to-day life reality of war and enduring that, surviving it, my own fantasies, if you will, my ideas about war changed dramatically. I think, to be honest with you, it was very traumatic for me initially, the first few years of doing this book, because I hadn't prepared myself to process in a healthy way what I was seeing. As I said before, the physical risk I expected, and of course it's unsettling when someone's shooting at you or when you see people killed around you. But I think the hardest part for me was to see certain things, to hear certain stories, to gain this intimacy in a very unusual way for a journalist, to gain this intimacy with children who were fighting, with the families who watched their children go off to war, with the victims of these kids.
With young girls recounting their experience of being raped. Exactly.
And that's harder to let go. I mean, I was telling a colleague of mine, I worked so hard. I was very dogged, I think, about getting the stories that I wanted to get, presenting these stories in a certain way. I was very dogged about it. I was very committed to it. I spent a lot of effort, and a lot of risk to get to these places and get to these people. But you do all these things to get to this place, and then it's so much harder in a way to let go of it, to forget. It's like you want to capture the stories, you want to gather the stories, report them, write it, and then in a way you wish you could close the book and that would be done. But the stories, the nightmares stay with you. And I think for me the hardest part, or the point at which I knew I had to stop, that I was done, was in Rwanda, when I was interviewing a young woman who survived a very brutal gang rape and sexual assault during the genocide there in 1994, and she was recounting her story to me. And as she was talking, I started crying because as she was talking, I could see my own daughter's face. My daughter's very young, but more and more as I was talking to these kids, these young people, I kept seeing my own child's face. And for me, in a way, that became very unbearable. It was much easier when I could separate, their experiences and horrors, from myself, from my family. But then, once I got to that level where I was seeing my daughter's face, or when I was incorporating their pain, I knew it was time to let go of the book at that point.
Mm-hmm. Let go in the sense of bringing it to an end and started to compile it.
Exactly. I mean, really ending the field research component of it. I mean, I kept going back and forth to these countries over and over again, talking to the same families, going to the same communities, finding the same kids over and over again. And obviously, it was a very natural thing to develop relationships with these people, with their situations. And when I say let go, I mean let go in the sense that I knew I had to go back to New York and just put it to paper. Mm-hmm. On one of my first trips to Uganda, in fact, in northern Uganda, an elderly Ugandan man said to me, "If a dying man tells you his story and you don't pass it on, you'll be haunted." And for a time period, I felt like I was haunted because this was 6.5 years in the making, and I hadn't passed it on. Mm-hmm. So letting go for me, in a sense, began when I finished the book and when I started passing on these stories. Because really, that's I was able to get the access I did, Don, because people sort of intuitively understood what I was trying to do. They knew that I wanted to tell their stories, but tell their stories in a way that hadn't been done before. Mm-hmm. And they, sort of invested their lives in me to pass it on.
Yeah. Well, reading your book and the beautiful way that you write, you do tell that story, and it's a difficult story. The stories you write in the first person, and you feature individuals and places and events in the retelling of these stories that mark a very horrendous and difficult phenomena of I mean, war and murder and destruction is bad enough. But when you recruit and use children, it is certainly a loss of innocence that is impossible to recover. You tell a story of the young boy who had to kill his nephews with a farming implement. Yes. That is something that obviously is difficult for you to deal with, as well as it is for that young man who had to do that during that particular crisis. Innocence lost when child soldiers go to war. Jimmie Briggs, and I want to thank you very much for doing this work. It's a very important work. You don't sometimes we don't know that war brings with it this use of children in so many different places. You talk about Columbia, and you talk about Africa and Afghanistan and Asia. So it's all around the globe, the use and misuse of children in this way. I look forward to your next project. I hope you have one in store, but I want you to recover from this one. And I hope everyone gets an opportunity to read Innocence Lost when child soldiers go to war. Very important piece of work, and it's important stories for us to know about the use of children in this way. Thank you, Jimmie, for being with us. I wish you well with your daughter, who's 4 years old now.
Yes.
Right? And I want everyone to thank you for being with us today. And I want you to seek peace, find peace, and most of all, be peace.